Good morning and welcome to our latest leadership series. I think we're in the mid 40s now, spanning the last coming on 4 years of interviewing leaders within the provider MSO space. Jason Howard is currently the CEO of MedQuest and has a wonderful background, including a senior executive role at Sound Physicians as well. Jason, as we always start, if you could give us a little bit of your background, how did you end up at MedQuest?
Yeah. Thanks, Roy, for having me. Kind of like a lot of us, I'm sure on the call, it's a little bit like the Talking Head song, "How do you get here?" Because there's been a lot of twists and turns and things like that. But I'll start back. I started out as a physical therapist, actually. So I was, played sports growing up, thought that was the way I wanted to go. Enjoyed being involved with it, and went to school, became a PT, practiced for a very short period of time, and kind of two things happened. One was I realized that I really like the business side of healthcare, and just like having my hands involved in a lot of different things. But the other part of it was I just wasn't that good of a clinician, possibly because of the former piece versus the latter. But I'll say that kind of throughout my career, that part of taking care of patients and understanding sort of that piece of it has sort of resonated all the way through. And it sounds cliche, but it's true, sort of in everything we do, including here at MedQuest. So spent the first decade of my career in rehab related businesses, publicly traded, some private equity backed, and a very short stint of not-for-profit, just enough in the not-for-profit world to make me realize that I'm not cut out to be in the not-for-profit world very long, just the pace and the bureaucracy and the red tape, et cetera. And then, went in a different direction and worked for a publicly traded hospice company for a period of time. But throughout all of those pieces, really kind of found what we do here in healthcare services, specifically related to the interaction between the provider and the patient, is really what my job has always been. From there, as you mentioned, spent a 10-year stint with Sound Physicians where, we went through two recapitalizations while I was there, grew tremendously, diversified, took a lot of risk in value-based care, did some really great things. And through that, when I decided that I wanted to kind of make a move about a year and a half ago, and do something different, I had an opportunity to take a step back and say, what do I want to, where did I have the most fun? What were things the most exciting? I was kind of agnostic, as I mentioned, to individual spaces because I'd worked across a variety of different ones. But the first thing in my mind was, who's going to be the sponsor? If you're going to be a private equity backed organization, that's going to be the difference, particularly in these roles of, having a tolerable life, if you will, and one that, you can really enjoy. The second was I was looking for a business that had some real meat on it, but it had an opportunity to scale up nationally, kind of like what we did at Sound over a decade. And then third, sort of as related to that second, is you just wanted to find a space that had a wrinkle in it, something that was going on both from a business standpoint and from a clinical standpoint. And I'd got to know the guys. This is a TPG-backed company out of their growth fund. And I got to know the guys from the growth fund pretty well through a sister company of theirs called Go Health. CEO of that company, Todd Latz, and I have known each other for quite some time. We're both Atlanta based, and got to see firsthand sort of the way that they worked with him and his team and scaled up his organization really over the last decade, which is a tremendous hold for a private equity backed organization. So when they looked to make the play to acquire MedQuest about 2 years ago at the end of 22, it just felt like a lot of things were aligning for me. It is based here in Atlanta. That wasn't a key driver for me because Sound was based out of Seattle when I was the president and COO there. But at the same time, I really liked the idea of having, an equity organization that I knew, kind of knew the people, knew the way that they treated their portfolio companies. Number two, a business that had, good operational base on it, at 50 or so centers today, but really kind of focused in on national scaling. And then third, an industry that I'm sure we'll talk more about here in a little bit, within the imaging space specifically, that's just ripe for explosion, but also has a little bit of a nuanced twist as it relates to the payer side.
So that's fantastic. Thank you. And what an amazing journey you've been on, how far you've traveled and how much you've seen. Starting at Sound Physicians as president of Sound Physicians, which was a very large company, very national. I don't know if everybody knows Sound Physicians, but I think the latest count over 5,000 clinicians. How do you think of Sound Physicians, the time that you were there and what it is today versus other large groups like Julie, Summit, Village MD? How did Sound Physicians compare and contrast to those other large aggregators?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things in the physician practice management space, particularly things that are at scale that have had some difficulties in the most recent years. I would say the nuance with sound, specifically, was that it always came from a value-based perspective. Even before we actually had true at risk or any kind of contracts like that, it started out initially as hospital medicine, where a lot of the others or in primary care practices, outpatient practices, and then in the case of the Envisions and the Team Healths and the SCPs of the world, were really more ER based and kind of moved into other settings. It came out of, in the early 2000s, being a focus with the hospital-based DRG reimbursement, where there was a quality corridor that depended upon certain quality metrics that you could either have an enhanced or a declined, a slightly nuanced, payment reimbursement for the same DRG. And for the first time, kind of the CFO is now on the side of the CMO, and then the CEO being able to sway them over. So we do need to focus a little more on the quality side of it, and that's really where sound started. And I think that DNA kind of carried on throughout the entire trajectory as we diversified into other service lines, critical care, emergency medicine, anesthesiology. A lot in the SNF space as well. As you mentioned, about 5,000 physicians across those, about 500 hospitals. In addition, we took about $2 billion in risk across a variety of governmental and commercial payers as well, when it was truly, based upon our ability to reduce spend, particularly in the post-acute discharge segment of it. So I think that part of it. Now, there are a lot of others that sort of came in, but they came in even deeper on the value-based care side as it was evolving. In many ways, we were kind of there as it was evolving, figuring things out, made a lot of mistakes across those years. Particularly as we were focusing on decreasing the post-acute spend. So the spend that takes place, about 60% of the spend in the patient's 60-day care that takes place after they get discharged from the hospital. There's a lot of things that we learned by trial and quite a bit of error in that piece of it as well. So I mean, I think that may be just some of the slight nuances we had at Sound versus the way that some others approached it.
That experience, is that very formative and something that you draw upon every day at MedQuest, given the nature of what MedQuest does? So maybe we transition into MedQuest,
Sure.
focused on imaging centers, MRIs, mammography, but in many cases, if not in every case, in partnership with a health system. Do you want to just describe what MedQuest's strategy is and the connection between Sound Physicians and MedQuest?
Sure, and you hit on one of the key ones. Is just a quick synopsis on MedQuest. MedQuest has been around for 25 years, three primary phases, late 90s till about 2007, 2008. Obviously, long before my time, they were just an aggregator of imaging centers. It originally started out whenever Stark Law and anti-kickback, kind of went into place in the late 90s, and a lot of physician groups were having a divest of interest, including imaging, that they were self-referring. And they grew to about 120 centers in 15 states, once again, based in Atlanta, as far west as kind of Arizona, Nevada, et cetera. Around that time, Novant Health, which is a large non-for-profit health system out of North Carolina, had a lot of overlap in the footprint with MedQuest, and liked what they were doing. And like a lot of health systems, they have their enterprise arm, so sort of their investment arm, their partnership arm, they're almost kind of quasi private equity arm, if you will, and they acquired MedQuest. And then immediately they did, which is, what a lot of health systems do. They began to rationalize that and take, in some ways, some of the things that were very unique and good about it, that was a real interest in acquiring it, and shrunk it down, both from a footprint standpoint, took it down to about 50 or so locations where we are today, predominantly in the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. But at the same time, they were doing something that really wasn't happening in the space. And this, we'll get to your relevant point in a second after the background, Roy, which is they were operating both hospital-based and freestanding centers underneath the same umbrella in the same market, and in some cases, literally a mile or two apart from one another. And then, and quite honestly, even now, that's that's just, a lot of health systems don't want to do that because they worry about the cannibalization of the very lucrative hospital-based imaging business. They worry about that going into their freestanding centers, pulling that away. But MedQuest, underneath that Novant umbrella at the time, from this is 2008 till really the end of 2022, so I call it a 14, 15-year period of time, was able to demonstrate a model in which you could have both grow and actually create a complementary sort of hub and spokes aspects of it. And I know that's one of the things that interested me. It's one of the things that interested TPG is there was quite a bit of private equity money looking towards imaging specifically just because of the explosion and the growth of the technology and the things that can be done in imaging, et cetera. So sort of this third phase we're just recently into is carving that business out and focusing not solely, but pretty tightly towards healthcare partnerships. I spoke on your panel, our panel, in New York a little over a month ago about this specifically, and I do truly believe, once again, it sounds like a cliched phrase, but the sweet spot of healthcare is where you can combine sort of the strength, stability of a health system with the agility, the nimbleness of an organization that's got a focus such as ours in imaging or in other spaces. Very analogous to what we did at Sound. Hospital medicine, emergency medicine, critical care, anesthesia. Very narrow space where you have the gift of focus, you have the ability to execute in a much more nimble fashion than a health system can, but in partnership with health systems. Earlier in my career was a company called Rehab Care Group. We did the same thing with the rehab space as well, outpatient rehab, home health, et cetera. Very narrow focused, very ability to execute. And when you take it against the imaging platform, because there's been the concept for a long time of site of care neutrality, to where effectively, regardless of whether you're going to a hospital-based or a freestanding location, you get charged the same amount. From a pure consumer's perspective, it makes sense. It's like, okay, I'm going to get the same machine, the same scan. Why is there a different rate depending upon a designation that takes place? On the backside, there are some aspects of it that kind of ensure higher quality, higher focus, et cetera. But in many cases, on the surface, there's really not a difference. In some cases, because of sort of the capital intensive nature of this business, it's some of the difficult capital procurement processes with health systems. The equipment in the hospitals is actually more antiquated than the equipment in some of the freestanding providers like the RadNets of the world, et cetera. So that's really where the opportunity is and where our focus is partnering with, in a joint ventured fashion, health systems, but pulling underneath that umbrella both hospital-based and freestanding assets under the same market. Common marketing team, common scheduling platform, common capital deployment team so that we can create those complementary models, but being able to allow the hospitals to be able to get out of their hospital base and become much more of an ambulatory, retail-oriented footprint for imaging.
So since you took the reins at MedQuest in a year and a half, how has the business performed in terms of partnering with a broader coalition of client partner health systems across the country? Obviously, long-standing focused relationship with Novant and its footprint, but now a very different business model, open architecture, willing and able to partner with systems across the entire country. How is that going?
Yeah, and I'll kind of get to that in a second, but the first thing I'll say is, and this is an experience I had from Sound as well, where we grew tremendously, very rapidly over, periods of time, is we wanted to have a deliberate focus on making sure that we focus on our platform and ensure we were ready for growth. The organization had been a wholly owned subsidiary as large of a part of a large non-for-profit business for, a decade and a half almost. So I had to bring in an entirely new executive team. I mean, everybody was new: CFO, CIO, chief clinical officer, COO, chief people officer. The one person I kept was the former CEO, who's the development officer here. So we needed to bring in a whole new team. They needed to bring in a whole new team. We had to put in new systems, IT systems, moving to a much more advanced, cloud-based environment with a higher level of cybersecurity, because if you can do partnerships with health systems, they have to have that. So we really didn't go to market a whole lot actively. We had some inbound interest through relationships, through some of the people I knew, through Novant's relationships, through TPG's relationships, et cetera. But we really didn't go to market deliberately until earlier this year, kind of mid-year, maybe Q2, to be able to go out and really start canvassing for relationships in an advanced way. Because what I did not want to have happen is we go out, we launch into the gate, and then we collapse underneath their own weight. Once again, I'll go back to TPG, the private equity backing, and some of my thinking with it. Know who you're partnering with, and make sure that they have the same focus and the same mindset of how you want to grow, and that you want to make sure you do it in the right way. And they did. So with that being said, yeah, we're in advanced discussions with about a dozen different health systems. Some, would be, almost, they would be transformational because they would effectively double the size of MedQuest overnight. Others are much more tuck-in from there. I mean, we have a target size that says if we're going to do, a market that we want to make sure we feel like we can grow to 8 to 10 imaging centers over time in that market. So we have a certain level of concentration. But, as we discussed on the panel a month ago, number one, when you're talking about, doing anything with the health system, it becomes an elongated process. You start talking about a joint venture, which is, effectively a marriage for life. That kind of adds a lot more to it. And then you take something such as imaging, which is so inherently, built into the thinking of a health system. This is what we do. This is part and parcel to our offering to the community. These things take, it's big game hunting. These are things that take, not weeks and not months, but literally quarters, if to not years, to work out and kind of work through. So, we're at the phase where, we're on the cusp, knock on wood, of being able to announce some exciting things here in the next, possibly by the end of the year. We're running out of a little bit of working days, if you will, to get that done. But if not, shortly after the first of the year on a couple of the new relationships and partnerships we have. And I'll say that the concept, it's interesting when you're dealing with them, you've got the different constituents in the room. Your chief strategy officer, the person who's generally in every health system now trying to drive these type of deals, they're all for it. They're aware of the pressures they're facing. They're aware how they need to, be better on the ambulatory footprint and kind of outreaching into the community using things such as urgent care and ASCs and imaging now as well. Then you'll have the operations folks, which are always going to try to make the case, well, why don't we just do that ourselves? And of course, the retort to that is oftentimes not that I can say it is, well, why haven't you then? And then the CFO you've got to convince. So there's a lot of different constituents that you need all the thumbs to come up on it. And it just takes, it's just a decent amount of time to make sure that everybody's aligned with it because it is a big risk for them if something were to, go wrong with their imaging platform.
So you've been in this space, this MSO partnership with health system space for a very long time. I guess two questions. What, beyond it taking a very long time and the different actors that come into play representing the system's needs, you mentioned several of those C-suite positions. What other advice would you give an MSO looking to knock on the door of the health system marketplace and introduce their differentiated service offering outside of imaging? I know that this brings me to my second question, which is where do you think health system MSO partnerships are heading? We've got a section on it in Scale Community, just that question, because we think it's fascinating. And we are very bullish that the number of MSO health system partnerships will grow significantly as it has done over the past 10 years, looking forward. And that will open the door to many more interesting developments and innovations as well. So really, two-part question. What other advice would you give an MSO that's new to the health system partnership space? What do health systems like to see from potential MSO partners? And where do you think the category is moving?
Yeah, I'll start with the last because I think it's easiest to work back in the other direction. I'm also very bullish on it. And I think it's because success breeds success. And I think really the industry is, kind of almost demanding it. And on the success breeds success aspect of it, you're talking about, there's just great examples of it. Whether it's through, just I mentioned several of those before that I'm very close to, but there's a lot of others as well, whether it's urgent care, whether it's, ASCs. Even now in the imaging space, we're certainly not alone in this endeavor. Our approach is slightly nuanced and different because of the depth and breadth that we want to take with our relationships is a lot more than others have. But I think people are seeing it in other health systems. And if there's one thing in my experience when you work with health systems is when they see their sister health systems and there's a lot of movement among them, something that works over there. It's like, well, why are we not doing that? And I think that's just going to continue to lend itself. The second thing is it's just, the continued pressures that are going to take place, whether it's on the capital aspects of it, of the payer side, et cetera, is just going to require it as well. So that piece of it, I'm very bullish on. As far as advice goes, to people, I mean, there's nothing that's, nuanced. Just I would always be looking for when you're having the discussion with the health system, look beyond just sort of your core offering. It's like, where can you be complementary to them? Where can you do other things that are important to them? So, in our world, you talked about mammography. Obviously, that's a big play, within our space itself. You've got sort of MR, CT, PET CT, sort of that side of it. But with mammography specifically, understanding where they're focused in on their oncology, understand those downstream implications of it. So where can you be complementary to them in ways beyond just your core offering? And you do a little homework on that and understand where can you do that. We talk about a lot of time now in imaging. We can be another flag for them out in the community, depending upon their ambulatory strategy. So when you're talking to them in a more broad sense, number one, they're going to view you more as a partner versus a vendor, and think about you in more meaningful ways, for you to understand that. So I think it's very easy just to stay focused. This is my lane. This is what we do, and that's important. But it becomes a little bit of table stakes. They expect that, and once again, it can fall back to we can just do that on our own. So that side of it. And number two, just always be thinking through what's happening that you can be innovative in your care delivery as well. And that kind of goes a little bit to that first piece of it, is that side of it. So it would just be think broadly, understand broader strategies, understand how your service can be complementary of that. And through your initial discussions, make sure that that comes across, because those will be things that will resonate with them long after they move to another meeting or another meeting or another meeting, where they have these kind of key strategic priorities. If this can weave through that, it feels like it can tie in as well.
I do feel like the MSO market is perfectly positioned for these health system partnerships, and I have an interesting takeaway that I repeat often, that the number one thing that private equity has done for healthcare in America is produce MSOs for the benefit of health system partnerships. And it seems an odd statement to make because it seems a little premature. But my sense of the health system space is that they're slow to move, as you mentioned, Jason. And they like to move with partners of similar large size. They don't feel that comfortable with tiny assets, startups. They want strength and certainty, low risk. And so what have we done? We've converted, tens of thousands of practices that are all disparate, small, 1Z, 2Z, 10Z practices into MSOs with 500 to 1,000 physicians. And we've offered those platforms and are increasingly offering those platforms, urgent care, ASCs, imaging, to health systems to partner with, which are far more likely to succeed. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I
And
agree.
maybe take that thought and turn it into a question. What else do you think has or is private equity doing to facilitate improvements in healthcare across the country?
I mean, so first off, I agree. I mean, whether anything's perfectly aligned, who knows? Obviously, because of the steward relationship and some of the things that were, taking place there, private equity taking a little bit of a hit, but you don't, throw out the baby with the bathwater, if you will. There's plenty of other, counter good examples that private equity, to your point, does drive just a greater degree of
Yeah, but I would push back on Stewart. That's another example of Apollo being an aggressive lender, sales leaseback sponsor. It's not traditional private equity. We everything gets bucketed
Oh
together.
yeah,
But if our politics understood the difference between a Cerberus, Apollo, and even Blackstone approach to high yield debt versus a Welsh Carson approach or TPG approach to growth equity, the world would be a much better place.
no, I agree with you. But I mean, once again, to your point, it's easy, particularly in an election cycle. So thank God that's over, to be able to paint things with broad brushes, and throw everything in together. But the point being, back to your original question, the other thing that I just feel like, quite honestly, that private equity brings, and it's built into the name, so it feels like it's a little redundant, is the equity itself, just the capital aspect of it, where more and more health systems are becoming capital starved, and they have greater needs, as some of their assets. We'll all see the ivory towers that get built here and there, and some of those, some of that. But if you go just to the rank and file hospitals around the country, there's a lot of capital neglect that's taken place. And not just in imaging, which once again is a very capital intensive business by its very nature, but just sort of broadly within that, the ability to kind of come in and be able to provide another equity and capital arm to a health system so that they can keep up with the individual providers that are, either equity backed that they're competing with for certain services and keep those services within the health system. I mean, once again, I'm the biggest advocate for, the healthcare capitalist system because I feel like, it just builds the better mousetrap. It forces you to think about the consumer. It forces you to think about the technology, and it forces you to think about the providers, and what you do with them within that front. So I think that by the very nature of, all the things that we've talked about that an MSO brings, gift of focus, gift of execution, being able to stay at the forefront and drive it for the health system, keeping those patients so that, the health system is always going to continue to be the place where those that without means are able to be seen, the amount of write-offs that they do, either through people that are presenting to their ERs and being able to provide other levels of care to avoid some of that stuff. Because of very, narrow focus in a space, but then to your point, being able to leverage across a broad footprint is tremendous. The other thing that comes from it, and you mentioned sort of the aggregation and those pieces, is just becoming a learning organization. You can then bring to a health system things from different markets, that you import and then maybe from their market export to other markets as well. So, if one of the things we're doing in our space today, we actually start Friday of this week with some of the first pilots of it is remote radiologist, the technologist reads to where you don't even have the technologist on site. They're remote with somebody else on site to kind of continue to meet the supply demand imbalance is taking place overall. Certain health systems are not, ready for that. And as I put it to them, they're not progressive enough right now. They're getting resistance from their academic, physician arms, et cetera. But it's an example of we're doing it in certain markets that are prepared for it or in markets that we control completely. And whenever you are ready, then we can bring it to you. And I think that's another advantage of sort of a broad footprint platform is you have the ability to beta test things across multiple markets and pull in best practices from those markets when the time is right.
So you've led national platforms that are very diverse in terms of service offerings to our physicians, and national platforms that are far more focused in MedQuest. You've also seen regional density, and you've seen the benefits of national footprint and market penetration. How do you think about those two subjects? Because they remain paradoxical to a lot of CEOs. Should I diversify? I know that my patients would love me to offer them everything, but my managers will certainly struggle with the added complexity and risk. Should I expand into non-contiguous states, non-adjacent states? There's an opportunity on the other side of America, the West Coast. I'm here on the East Coast. Should I take the opportunity on? Should I grow slowly, incrementally, and linearly? First regional, then national. How do you view those two subjects? Are you strongly skewed towards one versus the other, or do you see them all as circumstance driven?
I would separate even those two questions into another one. I don't worry as much about geographic distribution. It's just for me and the businesses I've been involved with, which, as you mentioned, is across a variety of different sectors. I think as long as you're committed to, what's required of the local infrastructure, putting that into place, it just provides you a greater relevance, across the country, and you can kind of fill in the gap. So that part of it has never really concerned me across time zones, across geographies, et cetera. There are certain reasons I prefer to avoid California if I can, but that has more to do with the regulatory piece than anything else. So that part of it. The part about diversification, though, that is one that I'll just say it's sound we struggled with greatly. We were always getting asked by hospital partners, hey, you're doing great in this service or that service. Can you also do this because we're not happy with this, whether it was anesthesia or whatever. And I will say, we made some mistakes in both understanding the complementary nature of it and the way we could leverage our back office MSO functions across those, whether it was, a lot of that in that space in particular. And a lot of our spaces is around the recruiting, privileging, credentialing functions that you have to have in place and how those kind of crosswalk between them. And then we really, we spread our teams way too thin.
Yep.
So to that point, it's like
I would say if you're willing to drive in every direction, you better be willing to drive in reverse.
Yeah. And I mentioned before some of the retrenching we did in our value-based care plays there as well. I mean, again, example was we entered into the bundled payment program. We were the largest episode initiator when it came out, and then the second iteration of it, BPCIA, that came out. For those that aren't familiar, effectively what it was a governmental program that was put out, that said that you would take risk on a certain, once there was an anchored mission to a hospital. So it was perfect for us because if we started avoiding admissions to hospitals, we would be out of business, since that was our entire business, was contracting with hospitals for their acute care services. But post discharge for that, you would take risk on a 60-day episode. So the Bundle Payment Care Initiative was the program. And so we started taking a look at that. I was like, this is custom made for us because we have, we know what the DRG payment effectively is going to be for the hospital. Patient gets discharged, and those were largely unmanaged in the past. So it wasn't even necessarily good healthcare. Certainly wasn't good business. People would get discharged out of the hospital. What would you do? Find the quickest place you can get them out of the hospital. And they could very well go from an inpatient rehabilitation facility to a SNF to a home health, all within a 60-day stay, where you're like, do you really need all of that? So the program itself lended itself to what we felt like we could do. Our execution upon it was horrible out of the gate. We decided, it's like, you know what?
And how can it not be?
Yeah,
You know,
it was a pilot. I mean, it was a pilot.
not only you're doing something for the first time, but it's not like you're not busy doing what you normally do.
That's exactly right. And we refined it over time. We went out and we hired a bunch of nurse practitioners around the country and started deploying them to people's homes when they were discharged, because our whole mantra was home, home, home. Get them home, keep them home. And if they ended up in a shorter like a SNF or something else, get them home as quickly as possible. So we went out and hired a bunch of nurse practitioners, deployed them around the country, found out that's not our that's not our business. We're not good at the logistics size of it. That's kind of pretty common business now. My daughter's a nurse practitioner, works for United Health, does this all the time. For Optum. But it wasn't something we did. So we went out and hired a bunch of nurse practitioners. A few months later, a year later, we had to let go of a lot of nurse practitioners. We went out and hired a bunch of sniffists to go see our patients that went into the skilled nursing facilities. And what we realized very quickly was that we had misaligned incentives. Their incentive, because of the way they were reimbursed, was to keep the patient into the SNF as long as they could, to be able to generate the professional fees that are associated with it. Our goal was to keep that short. So we had to kind of get rid of that as well. And we finally hit the sweet spot. It was really going to what was our core in that business, which was, speaking to the physicians, educating them on what's the highest quality of care. What are the best SNFs that you go to? You look at a given community, it's amazing how the difference between like a Medicare Advantage length of stay in a SNF and a Medicare fee-for-service stay in a SNF. Same patient population, same diagnosis, just different payer, different financial incentive for the SNF, but we began to manage that part of it very directly, and that's where we became very effective on that play. So coming back to your broader point with those examples, I think it is understand those things that you tangentially can be involved with and leverage your core strengths and your execution abilities. Or the alternative is be serious that this is starting an entirely new business and invest in it as such. Don't try to do it, in a half-assed way to where you think, hey, this is a great opportunity to become more relevant to my partners, and kind of offer another thing that they need without the full commitment. And I'm going to make all this money on the margins because I've got all this built-in infrastructure. Just be very, very honest with yourself, looking in the mirror and say, what is this? How much can I leverage on my current? How much of my current, mind share for my team and myself can I leverage against it? And execute accordingly.
Yeah, I think someone needs to go on mute, but yeah, it's almost like the de novos versus acquisitions debate. Diversify versus remain focused debate has similar qualities in that you can sort of guarantee certain attributes and hardships.
My key.
Yeah, sorry, I need to find who's not on mute. Jimmy's phone is not on mute. Now he's on mute. Okay. Yeah, I was listening to Joe Rogan, and he has technical difficulties too, so we're in good company. Yeah. So talking about systemic elements. So yeah, I mean, that when you open a de novo, it's going to it has its timeline to maturity. you know that it's probably not going to come with a multiple on free cash and a high degree of free cash-based leverage multiples, right? It's probably going to be asset-based lending, working capital revolver, and it's going to be a hunt for new patients, new providers, a high degree of staff turnover initially because no one's ever worked at the de novo before. So everyone's coming together for the first time. You know that you're going to have these systemic ingredients, some of which will be reflected in your P&L and balance sheet, and some will be a lot more intangible, but they'll be there. And you know, similarly, when you do an acquisition, that you're going to deal with a large deployment of capital, and that relative to a de novo. You're going to deal with integration issues because you have to take existing everything and find a place for it in your existing. And so you're not escaping those integration issues. And so similarly, when we talk about these other approaches, we have to think about what's systemically going to be there for us. When we talk about diversifying revenues into new markets, you're talking about to some extent a de novo culture, right? New revenue streams require new people, new lessons learned, timeline, like you said, essentially a timeline to maturity. How much investment, how much P&L red, how much working capital deployment, how much intellectual capital buildup do you need before you reach maturity? And so your year 0 to 1 is always going to look very different than year 1 to 3, because just like joining a new school or a new company, that first year is always, you can guarantee a high degree of chaos. And so that's just interesting that mature companies sometimes underestimate, because they've reached stability, how much instability resides in de novos. I want to talk to you about the future. Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, Roy, just one final point on that. But I'll also, not to talk on the other side of my mouth, I also feel like it's an equally big mistake to just kind of go into your insular shell and say, hey, I do this one thing, and don't look for opportunities to become more relevant in the case of health system partners. As I mentioned earlier, I think that's one of the key things to think through, or just in relation to the market. Otherwise, you become Kodak, or you become Xerox, or you become another company that just does not look at the world around them and understand it. But the point being, you've got to do that side, particularly as the strategy leader for your organization. But also, you've got to be very, very conscious about the tactical execution that takes place, so you don't put yourself in a bad place. So it's truly trying to strike the balance between the two, because as much as we made those mistakes at Sound, the organization wouldn't have grown. We certainly wouldn't have had the success that we had across those years, and the recapitalizations, et cetera, if we had have just sort of say singularly threaded on the one thing that we offered out of the gate.
I couldn't agree with you more. That's our philosophy too. We sort of analogize leading a company to skiing. And with skiing, they always say, if you're not falling, then you're not really skiing. And with running companies, if it's too easy, that's a sign that you've delegated the future of the company to macro conditions. And if it's hard, that means you're looking beyond macro conditions and creating opportunities that may preempt macro conditions and might even influence macro conditions. Sort of the difference between harvesting and sowing. All right, so let's talk about the future. So we've got a few trends going on here, my friend, and they're really exciting. We spoke about hospital partnerships, health system partnerships with MSOs plural, accelerating and accelerating. We also spoke in our last month's leadership series with Wyatt, who runs the healthcare team at Kane. And he spoke about the likelihood of health systems coming into the MSO space from an acquisition standpoint. We can't private equity exclusively forever. At some point, a sponsor is going to look for strategics to sell to. And lo and behold, GI Alliance announced its exit to Cardinal Health in the last few weeks, since we had that conversation with Wyatt and made that prediction. So our prediction is proving true within a matter of weeks. Here comes a large health system and buys the largest GI MSO in the country for, I think, north of $4 billion. An unbelievable valuation for a group that I met with it's about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, had no more than 60 physicians at the time. Today, it's 900 physicians. And so there is a strong argument that partnerships lead to investments and even acquisitions, and health systems will become an active buyer of best-in-class MSOs in this country. So maybe that's one momentum play for the future. But I want to hear your thoughts on that, balanced with other key themes and trends in the imaging space specifically.
Yeah.
None smaller than AI in healthcare, technology in healthcare, analytics, increased efficacy, and efficiency in healthcare. Lots of imaging going on in this country. How efficient is it today? How efficient is it likely to be in the future? Patient risk stratification. What role does imaging play in that? Value-based care. Sort of the large themes, these floating bubbles of trend and direction. Which ones are you most excited about? Where do you think the imaging space is going?
Yeah, I'll get to that in just a second. But to your point, and you mentioned Wyatt also has some inside information on some of these things, and not surprising he was able to be Nostradamus with some of the stuff that was happening. But back with the health systems, I agree that I mentioned early on about the enterprises arms that a lot of these health systems have, and those effectively are operating almost as kind of quasi private equity inside of health systems. And I do feel like there's going to be some more combinations or some announcements that were made, a joint venture that's getting started between Memorial Hermann, Baylor Scott and White, Providence, and Novant. That's kind of this arm that's going to be looking at some of this stuff as well. And I think you're going to see more and more of that, where they're going to want to have at least a passive investment. I mean, we're obviously have quite a few passive health system investors that are part of our organization today. When I say passive, less than, they don't control the majority of the organization that private equity does. But I can see where there's going to be more of that, because it is a way for them to kind of combat, number one, the perception of private equity, and number two, combat Optum in many ways as well. So anyway, that's just kind of on the macro health system space. On imaging specifically, I mean, you hit on a ton of them. I mean, what I'm going to start with is really the basis of it is just the continued advancements with the technology itself. I mean, as I started looking into it 2 years ago, it's amazing the things that, couldn't be done at all years ago, the type of detection, the level of detection. AI plays a key part of that. Or had you had to go, God knows where, to Mayo or somewhere else to get it done. So, that part of it to me is kind of the precursor to everything else we'll talk about. The second piece of that comes in is the advancement in the pharmaceuticals. And where those two cross over with one another is kind of what's referred to as theranostics. You heard of what the Leqembi, the Alzheimer's drug that was announced, about a year and a half, 2 years ago. But this idea that some of these clinical trials and pharmaceutical testing, and now the things that aren't even pharmaceutical testing, but that are being treated, it requires imaging to be able to view the results of it, both as it's being dosed, but then also kind of how the progression is going over a period of time. And that is just an amazing advancement. So the continued, sort of push within the space of new drugs that are coming out, new treatments that are coming out, new interventions that are coming out that require imaging is tremendous. Number two, is you mentioned some of this. The scans that used to take at half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour to take place, now you can do in like 7 minutes. It's no longer a limiting factor in this space to be able to, the technology and the scans aren't it. You used to sit in there, they had the open MRIs, they made a lot of noise, they were uncomfortable for people, particularly the closed board, but now the technology's advanced such a tremendous amount that it really is, how do you continue to work with the patients so that they feel like a patient and not a widget as they're coming through. That becomes a limiting factor on just the throughput of the centers and that side of it. By direct correlation to that, because there aren't any more radiologists and or technologists that are coming out, more technologists, but not really radiologists. It's the things that we talked about earlier. How do you do more remote reading? How do you kind of add AI to not replace, but to assist the professionals to be able to operate the top of their license, to call out specific areas, abnormalities over time. Really the leading space in that is mammography, where people will, hopefully have an annual mammography so you can watch that progression over time. You can look at things from the past to where they are but even with prostate cancer and other areas, to be able to sort of look at that part of it as well. The fourth, which is kind of where we're focused as well with the health system, is around becoming much more ambulatory focused and moving things out of the basement of a hospital to an MOB, to a strip mall, where it can be that accessible to go in and get that scan done in a very convenient way. And how do you arm the consumer with the way, as much as you possibly can, for them to control the scheduling process, the results process, along with their referring physician, but to be able to empower them in a way that they are in every other aspect of their lives. And we all have these, if not one, we got multiple of them that we're carrying around today. So how do you use those in a way to empower the consumer to be able to do so? So that's sort of on those pieces as I think about it. It's interesting, as I joined this industry specifically, how kind of antiquated it was on the payer side, though. It really is a fee-for-service environment. There's virtually no value-based care play in imaging whatsoever. The only sort of play within it is between trying to get people out of the hospital-based setting because of the higher, reimbursement into a freestanding setting, and that's kind of it. No real focusing on quality, no real focus on anything else. I've reached out to some of my former board members at Sound, which are part of Optum, and asked them about it, and they were like, "No, it's not something we think about," which is, kind of crazy to me when you think about what the technology can detect in a patient population, and the ability, the difference between detecting, a potential cancerous issue with the breast cancer at an early phase versus a late phase. Not just the benefit for the patient, of course, the mortality rates, et cetera, but also the cost benefit that's associated with that. So you hear about full body scans, you hear about some of that, and there's kind of debates on that, whether that's really the best way to approach or not. But certainly, if you take a look at a specific demographic based upon their family history, based upon some of the genetic aspects of information that's out there, and we're also started a pilot with a couple of companies that do that type of testing in addition to ours to better identify potential risk patients and proactively work with that patient group and bring them in. I think there's tremendous value for the overall health of the individual, as well as, the overall cost for, the larger healthcare community writ large, to be able to identify those things. And, if you combine that with the equipment that can now detect in a much easier way, creating a much easier access point with an ambulatory, retail-oriented environment, and kind of pushing that out there, I think that there's ways for us in imaging to become much more upstream as it relates to value-based care. I added a board member just who started back in my last board meeting in September, specifically working through, and I wanted to have somebody that had that experience in other industries, because I want to position us, to sort of take that proactive approach. So anyway, those are a lot of the areas that I feel like the industry is going, and quite honestly, where I want MedQuest to drive.
That's a very bright future, and lots of momentum and energy for imaging at large. So not surprised to hear that you're excited about being part of that and leading a lot of that. I want to open the floor to any of our audience who might have any last questions. Now would be the time.
Hey, Roy.
Go ahead, Mark.
Hey, Jason.
Hey.
So I had three questions. You already hit two of them. The first one was the effect of AI on diagnostic imaging, because I really believe that imaging is literally the key to the universe. I mean, and when I think of imaging, I think of Captain Kirk on the starship looking out into space. He sees everything, and the more you see, the more you know. So that was a good one. Also, cross-pollination of other, siloed medical specialties and technologies. You kind of hit on that, don't stay in your cubbyhole. But the third one, easy one. So why is it still so hard for a patient when they ask for their imaging to get something other than a CD?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. So once again, coming into it fresh, and I started to realize how much we spend on like burning CDs. And I was thinking back to almost my college days. It's like, oh my God. That part of it I can't explain exactly why. I think it's just one of those things that people have got comfortable with in this space. But as you have disruptors that are coming in, to it. There are now new PACS platforms and new things that are just becoming more progressive and leveraging technology in other ways. So I agree with you. And I think that you're going to see a significant amount of change with that approach. RadNet, which is clearly the leader in this space, on the technical imaging side, is definitely the one that's at the forefront of it. And I think, just like everything else, once people have seen, nobody carries their Walkman anymore, so I think the same thing is going to happen. And I mentioned this earlier, to put it in the palm of somebody's hand, in their provider's hand as well. There's no reason that can't be done. The technology exists in other industries.
Not only that, like just yesterday, my wife had an ultrasound. I asked for a copy of the imaging. They looked at me like I had a third eye.
Yeah.
And secondly, you carry a CD into your other doctor or like an orthopedic office, and they'll tell you, we don't even have a CD reader anymore.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think it is an area we've selected and partnering with a new PACS vendor now, and that's specifically what we've rolled it out to a few of our sites in North Carolina and South Carolina that we're working with our radiologists on, and that's what it's going to allow us to do, is to digitally transfer.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot.
No, thank you. I appreciate the question, Mark.
Any other questions? Okay.
I do have one, Roy.
Go ahead.
It's Patrick Moore. You mentioned the complexities when sound entered into anesthesia and the limited resources you had for a lot of your recruitment and back office. We do a lot of work in radiology. How concerned are you as you look to expand in capacity and the availability of radiologists to read your images?
Yeah, probably you and I could probably debate, and I don't know which is one and which is 1A. Those, in my mind, are the two biggest professions that have a shortage right now, providers. At least in the case of anesthesiologists, you have CRNAs and AAs and things like that to supplement them. You don't have that in radiology. So to me, that's where AI will ultimately come in, and it has to come in, and is coming in on that side of it. With that being said, the predicted demand into the future far exceeds that supply. So that's a great level of concern on our side, and I think on the industry side, which is why we're looking to find ways to augment it as much as we can with alternatives, once again, led by AI. And this is, I have to say this in all these in case somebody takes a snippet and carries away with it. It's never to replace the professional decision-making ability of the radiologist. That is incumbent. It's to augment it and to help them so that we can move through it quicker, call their attention to, specific areas, that type of stuff. The second piece, and you look at this in all spaces, where there's just needless work that radiologists are doing today that can be farmed out to, assistants and things like that, so that they are truly just focusing in on the top of their license side of it. But certainly maybe something you and I can follow up on as well. We're always looking for options and alternatives, from remote aspects to international aspects to on-site aspects, to be able to, to be able to augment our radiologist abilities.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Jason, for being such a wonderful guest and for educating us. This will make for a wonderful podcast and a beautiful interview series. So really looking forward to publishing it. Thank you.
Thank you.